So, you know, if you believe these assumptions, then you come up with certain ways to organize the industry and certain kinds of business models. So if you believe that you can put a drug on the market in 5 years rather than 12, and I've read dozens of business plans of new ventures where they say exactly that because their technology is so much better than what came before, it won't take them 12 years to develop a drug. It'll take them 5 or 6 years. If you believe that's the case, then short-term financing arrangements are exactly what you'd want to see. And collaborations should be very short-term, or what I call shallow. The second is if you believe that the technology is modular, then what you'd want to see is very specialized firms. Just like you see in software or electronics industry, companies don't vertically integrate. They focus in little pieces because the technology is modular. So if you believe the technology is modular, then that's exactly what you'd want to see. Third, if you believe the new drives out the old, then you realize that you'd believe that new firms have an advantage over old firms. And there's no real advantage of cumulative learning or firm experience. So a 30-year-old firm is not at any particular advantage to a 2-year-old firm or a 1-year-old firm. In fact, a 30-year-old firm may be at a disadvantage. So if you believe those assumptions, then you'd expect the industry to look actually the way it does, because these are the assumptions the business has been built upon. And biotech has borrowed models from elsewhere. The venture capital and public equity models, the monetization of intellectual property, and the idea of spinning off lots of new firms from universities. But if we look more closely at the realities of the science, we realize those assumptions that most business models are predicated on are just wrong. They're convenient because we know how to finance ventures where those assumptions are met, okay? But they're the wrong assumptions, and in some cases they're just false. So drug R&D is still profoundly uncertain and long. And while there's been dramatic advances in the underlying biology and our understanding of biology, you still can't put a drug on the market in 5 years. It still takes about a decade. And maybe with a lot of work, we can shorten that to 9.5 years. And maybe in some period of time, we could shorten it to 9 years or 8 years. But we're not getting the big jump, and we shouldn't expect that to occur for a long time. Because biology still remains an extraordinarily difficult, complex area with a lot of uncertainty. The second is that the knowledge base isn't very modular. It's very, biotechnology, you know, we use the term the biotechnology revolution, but it's not one revolution, it's multiple revolutions. And as Professor Ferrari spoke about this morning, it's all about the integration of these different bodies of knowledge. It's not one body of knowledge. All the innovations going on in the integration across disciplinary boundaries. And the third is the new doesn't drive out the old, it builds on the old. So the technologies which were around for 100 years ago are actually still important. Things like formulation, which everyone ignored for years, turn out to be extremely important. And there's a lot of basic skills that are required to put a drug on the market that don't go away. So if you start to then say, well, what are the ideal characteristics of a sector that has these characteristics? What would you like this sector to have? What are the ideal characteristics? You'd say, well, given the long-term uncertainty and risks, you'd want it to have the ability to manage risk and encourage risk-taking over long periods of time. What I'd argue is we actually have a sector that evolved to do just the opposite. It's structured in completely the opposite way that it should be structured in. Its focus is on short-term collaborations, short-term financing. By the way, a comment was made in the earlier session about venture capital. And venture capitalists don't have a long-term horizon at all. Their horizon is typically 3 years. A venture capitalist wants to be able to get in and out of an investment in 3 years. And they're not going to invest more than, 20 to 30, maybe $50 million in one venture. Now, that works in software. That works in electronics. That doesn't work in drugs because it takes 10 years and about $1 billion to put a drug on the market. So it's the wrong vehicle for financing drug development. We need the ability to integrate across disciplines. So instead of having lots of islands of very specialized companies, what we actually need is fewer companies that are more integrated. And third is we need the ability to learn from cumulative experience. So in fact, what we don't want is lots of new startups occurring all the time, but we want some maturity in the sector. I think there's a number of implications that I want to close on financing, organizational structures, and institutional. So on financing, I think the viability of the standalone publicly traded biotechnology company is very questionable. Among the very few companies which are successful, it's clear that probably the most productive and most successful biotechnology company is Genentech. And yet Genentech, while it's publicly traded, is 60% owned by Roche. So it's not the normal model. And I think it's very difficult. In the US, biotechnology companies have found it very difficult to pursue the publicly traded model. It leaves open the question, what's the right alternative? And I don't think we have good answers to that yet, but we don't have good mechanisms for funding the kind of long-term R&D that we need to. And in particular, we don't have mechanisms to fund translational research, although that's starting to occur now in the US. The NIH has launched a major new initiative in translational research, which is work that is in between basic and clinical. I think on organizational structures, again, as Professor Ferrari pointed out earlier this morning, innovation is inherently collaborative. And yet true collaboration in R&D requires more integrated organizational structures. One of the problems is in biotechnology, if you look at the average collaboration, where people use the fashionable term strategic alliance, in fact, they're not alliances at all. And they're not collaborations at all. They're very short-term contracts. The average collaboration in biotechnology between a major company and a biotechnology company is 4 years. That sounds like a long time until you realize it's 12 years, 10 to 12 years to put the drug on the market. So a 4-year arrangement is very, very short term. And my view is I think firms are pursuing the wrong approach to collaboration. They're going after lots of collaborations, going after dozens of collaborations. Some companies will do 40 collaborations per year, each of which is very short term and very shallow. My view is the industry should be following a different model, which is far fewer collaborations. Each one is deeper and represents a longer term commitment. And finally, on the institutional side, I think the links between universities and businesses are absolutely essential for getting this kind of science commercialized. So I'm absolutely in favor of these porous boundaries between universities and businesses. On the other hand, I think universities need to be careful not to lose sight of their mission, which is to disseminate knowledge broadly. And again, I can only speak from a US perspective, but one of the challenges, I think one of the dangers we're facing in the US is that universities are getting very focused on starting firms. And I'm not against starting firms out of universities. Again, I think it's a great idea. But I think universities have to realize that's not their mission. If there are people who are entrepreneurs who want to start firms, that's great, but they shouldn't be focused on that. And technology transfer offices in US universities have become very focused on how can we start up firms. There's lots of different ways to get knowledge into use, some of which is to start a new firm, some of which is to license knowledge to existing firms, and some of it is to actually license the technology or the knowledge broadly, non-exclusively. I also think universities have a very important role in terms of creating the cross-disciplinary research that, again, Professor Ferrari talked about this morning. One of the challenges in biotechnology and pharmaceuticals is the knowledge bases we have are very fragmented and very focused, and that often reflects the academic training of the people who come out of those universities. We don't have enough people who can work across the boundaries. So I'm going to just finish there and say that I think the major challenges facing biotechnology is for there to be organizational innovation that can match the considerable degree of scientific and technological innovation that we're seeing. Thank you.